at Ashraf Gada.
In fact, I've been counting the days to the end of the show. It's like 9 days, I think, if I include today. It's amazing how time flies, and I hope you enjoyed it. But I'll tell you what, some of the really great interviews we've done, they're all on the Salam Media YouTube page or channel. So please go out and check it out. Subscribe to the channel, like it, share it. Some really fascinating conversations, including the one we just had a few minutes ago with Fairuz Mohammed. Right. Well, let's talk about something that's particularly important. Where does South Africa fit in with regard to East-West with trade relations? But as we all know, there's trade and there's politics and there's geopolitics, and somehow they're all intertwined and they affect you. So why am I saying that? Because you may be aware there's this call with the BRICS summit coming up in August, right? And there's been this. On the one hand, the International Criminal Court has declared effectively Vladimir Putin, the head of Russia. Well, effectively, a warrant of arrest has been sent out to arrest him. So that's if he stays in his own country, then nobody's going to do that. But if he travels, and as he should be traveling to South Africa, then what happens next? So we probably the first call. Now, in the light of that, there's been comment from the Minister of International Relations, Foreign Affairs, Naledi Pandor, saying there's been a delegation that's being sent to the USA, effectively to try and explain why they want Putin here and why they don't want him arrested. Something along that line. We'll find out more when it really happens. Okay, so why? Because they don't want to lose business with the other partners, the USA. They also want to maintain business ties with Russia. And for you and I, who may be very confused about all these global political issues, trade somehow does impact on GDP of the country and does impact upon your lifestyle. Can you see? Suddenly, you're all very interested in what we're going to talk about next. So, with that in mind, let's chat to economist Lebogang Peku, who's going to give us her insights into South Africa, East versus West, and what that really means for our country. Lebogang, appreciate your time. Good morning.
Hi, Ashraf, and to the listeners.
Yeah, good morning. We haven't chatted in a while. I was just saying off air, we had such great chats on SAFM. It's a good few years ago, but it's certainly wonderful talking to you on this platform.
Same to you, indeed. It's been a long minute.
Yeah, too long. Absolutely. Well, hopefully your brain remains as sharp as always expected to be, because that's always was the case in the past. So let's talk about this. Just your broad strokes. South Africa. It's almost South Africa and Russia, or East versus West, with regard to economy and geopolitics. How does all this fit in for us?
Good question. So, I mean, we need to go back to basics. The first is that we have a history in South Africa, which President Ramaphosa has followed. I mean, there are a few key principles. The one is South-South solidarity, which I think that platforms like this are very committed to, and I think that observers like myself are very committed to. And this links to the notion of non-alignment, the Home Bandung project, where the idea of South Africa or any African country or even global southern country being caught up in political cold wars or even warm wars is something that really is anathema to us. And this is, of course, an overflow of the Cold War between the former Soviet Union and the United States. And that non-alignment is something we hold very dear. And this then links to the notion of what sovereignty means, independence of thought, of affiliation, of association, and of ideology, I would add. And of course, this then links, of course, to then a form of internationalism, progressive, solidarity-driven internationalism, and Afghanism. Pan-Afghanism, which of course means many things to many people, and I suppose the government's interpretation of Pan-Afghanism might be different to my own, for example. But I think that this all then dovetails into the evolution of South Africa's foreign policy. And I think the moment that we are in at the moment is certainly one in which the geopolitics of South Africa, which are vested in very strong relationships in the global south, the BRICS formation being one, our warm and fuzzy relationship with Cuba, our warm relationship with Venezuela, and of course with Russia. And for this reason, there's been a lot of criticism by the Euro-US bloc.
Yeah. So if we then look at something very, very current right now, and although we talk about August, it's current in world terms, right? Does South Africa face a conundrum in its dealings with Vladimir Putin, both politically and its impact economically?
So remember that South Africa recently abstained during the, has abstained continuously during each vote to to vote against Russia, to criticize Russia and the so-called Russian invasion on Ukraine, or the so-called war on the Ukraine. And this is really to do with again, a Pan-African commitment, which most African countries have made to be neutral. And of course, this has been viewed as a tacit agreement or tacit support. And of course, this depends on how one frames this so-called aggression on the Ukraine. And I think that this dovetails very clearly with the kind of internationalism and the notion of independence and sovereignty that South Africa holds very dear. I think another piece of this is that South Africa has its own complex and, of course, interesting history, especially the ANC-led South Africa. So the ANC as a party, of course, has a geo-historic link with Russia, which seems to be, of course, flowing over into this era. And I do think that it's important for us not to romanticize the past overly or uncritically, in the same way that people talk about China and say, Chairman Mao and all the wonderful things that China did for us back in the day. I think in the same way, I think I am very critical of the fact that Russia, has exercised racism towards African people, African citizens. Yeah. Some of the people that I know who grew up in Russia or who were, comrades in Russia, who spoke about the anti-blackness and the anti-African sentiment. And I think that this spills over into a very patronizing, paternalistic sometimes relationship that Russia, the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, and Russia has had with many African countries, including South Africa. So some of the racism that we saw in Ukraine against African people was, remember that Ukrainians and Russians are essentially first cousins, to all intents and purposes. And, there's no difference between that. So I think that we should always be critical. In terms of economically now, what Russia has brought to South Africa and to the African continent is quite minuscule compared to our relationship with China, even our relationship to India, which we don't give as much attention. So now, how does this link to the moment that we are in now? So, firstly, that among many countries and among many nations, there are several. There will always be the notion that the wars hurt our investment, ambitions. And I think that, if we look at, for example, across the board, so not only South Africa, the COVID pandemic, for example, and the way that global economic growth was expected to be quite modest, around 4% in 2022, and it was hoped that it would go up to about 4.5, 4.6, maybe even up to 5, right? In 2023, this is all according to the IMF, which has its own limitations. Now, of course, the Russia-Ukraine skirmish, as it were, pulled that into question, and of course, foreign direct investment trends immediately after this, and in tandem with the way that global economics move after there've been major ruptures. So COVID, the other wars, the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, you can name several, right? So one would suggest that this is not only per se a South Africa specific conundrum. It's a conundrum that many countries need to deal with this globe. Then also that the US needs to deal with the conundrum that they themselves are not the leading global power that they were 5, 10 years ago. That is also, an empire that is in deep crisis.
Because I think you're right. I mean, there's been often there's this default that the USA are the champions of human rights, and I mean, why we even think so, I don't really know. But maybe there's been enough of that storytelling exported globally that people believe that. They certainly see them as the global leader from an economic point of view, right? But increasingly, I mean, that position is now being eroded, right? For a whole series of decisions the US has been making, right? And therefore that point, and I'll go back to what Naledi Pandor said a few days ago about, like, who is the USA to talk about it? I mean, they've had a series of problems. Now look at issues about Libya, looking at Iraq. That just comes to mind just recently, right? That should they still be dictating what we should be doing? Which, as you answer that, doesn't necessarily mean, as you've suggested, that the Russians or the Chinese are actually any better either, right?
Yeah, no. I think that there's a case to be made, Ashraf, for us to stand on our own precepts of sovereignty, of global solidarity, which South-South solidarity, which is built on equal partnership, an alliance or partnership, friendship among equals, not among those who are viewed as junior, and certainly not to repeat the same extractive relationships, mineral extraction, even land extraction. The issues of land leasing by some governments are becoming very controversial across this continent. So I think that indeed we need to be very critical and very nuanced in this. Now, in terms of what we are responding to, unfortunately, when we speak about international relations and internationalism, oftentimes this has been a reflection of and revolving in the orbit of the United States and to a lesser extent the European Union and NATO forces and their allies and their interests. So interests that are seen as against those are then viewed as being dissidents, and that has really been the view. And if we look at for example, the last 20 years in which the rest of the world has essentially has literally been terrorized by America's war on terror. In the wake of the 9/11 bombing and so on and so forth, and of course, negating the circumstances that led to that. The invasion of Iraq, the invasion of Kuwait prior to that, the Desert Storm, and basically the lack of respect for sovereign judicial processes, especially across that region. So I think that we need to rethink for ourselves when it is said that foreign direct investments. This often, again, typically is a byword or a coded languaging for Western interests, and really a warning, a coded warning by the business community for African governments in particular, or majority world governments, to, in inverted commas, tone down their affiliation, and in this respect, in this instance, their alignment to, or their lack of criticism of Russia in the Russia-Ukraine skirmish. And if we look at how President Trump, the U.S., former President Trump, painful to use Trump and President in the same breath. I think that when we look at the way that U.S. judicial systems are battling Ashraf and the listeners to actually try to bring him to book, when the rest of the world were watching a coup d'etat. And I think I would argue that certainly South Africa and many African countries, the U.S., they would do with something like a Zondo commission at a time like this to do an inquest into what exactly happened at that time. It just goes to show how their own internal governance, their own sense of rule of law, and the fact that white supremacy is actually something that is far more important than their judicial systems at the moment, and has been a growing trend as well. There is nothing to admire in the U.S. There hasn't been anything to admire in their judicial systems, in their government, in their global interference, in their bullying, and et cetera, et cetera.
I remember, I think it is Prof. Landsberg, and I hope I've got it right from UJ at that time, saying, the USA is a democracy at home. Trump may argue with that, by the way, but he said USA is a democracy at home, but a dictatorship abroad, and we need to understand that, which I think is fascinating. Which, however, just gets me to this, and we can wrap up with this, right? So let's get to the economic issues, right? So you have this conundrum that besides the partisanship, South Africa wants to do business with the USA, and they do big business exporting and importing. On the one hand, then on the eastern side, you've got a part of BRICS, you've got Russia as well as China, right? In terms of what South Africa does next, in terms of how they play ball with Putin's issue with regard to BRICS, how much at risk is our economic relations with all three blocs? And what are the implications, therefore, for the country?
So, this is a really interesting question. The one is actually that in relation to those three blocs, there are three different geopolitical contentions that we're seeing at the moment. And we can see, for example, the one links to the de-dollarization of global economies. And this is something that I think it would be useful for us to keep our eye on going forward. Yeah. So there's several different implications for this. The fact that the Russian ruble has is now the has become the preferred tender of Russian gas and oil. And of course that's by Vladimir Putin, President Putin's demand, which shows that sometimes sovereignty does work, no matter how inconvenient it may feel for other people. Secondly, that China and Brazil have reached a deal to trade in their own currencies, which is again ditching the dollar US. And then the Chinese yuan has replaced the US dollar as the most traded currency in Russia for the first time. Now, if there's one thing that really then does upset the US is that the dollar hegemony can potentially be shifted. And I think that it's an interesting, fascinating hegemony because it's actually quite a synthetic one, which comes out of oil prices and so forth. And the oil war that came out in the 1970s. So I think that what we can deduce from this is that not only does this potentially mean that we're going to have a real sense in which there is a different way of viewing our relationship with money and the strength of money, but that if we can then rethink the idea that the US dollar as an ideal or as an idea, because the dollar is actually an idea. It's not backed by anything substantive. We have known this for a long time. If we look at, the fact that the only reason that, for example, the IMF, the World Bank, debt is paid back is in dollars US, which means that essentially, as we know, the US economy is hugely indebted into trillions. But because that the dollar, these debts are taken in their own currency, they don't owe themselves. I mean, it's basically a Ponzi scheme, and which the rest of the world has been part of. So I think that, all of this means that China, India, Russia, and these other powers have the potential to take the ascendancy and to then begin to, threaten the hegemony of that. But I think at the end of the day, it does come, this comes down to currency wars and the economy more than ideological issues or frankly anybody caring that much about the Ukraine.
Okay, well, I think that's a point well made. Perhaps let's end with this. I mean, you've given us a very good analysis. Now, let's just say this, and this is the last point, right? If, for example, you were asked by President Ramaphosa to give input and advice on this conundrum, and you were advised or asked by Naledi Pandor to give you input and advice on this conundrum, and whoever else, what would you tell them?
To stand their ground.
Stand their ground. Yeah. Now, stand their ground means do not.
In terms of solidarity, in terms of pursuing Africanism, in terms of pursuing our own sovereignty and our own autonomy, in terms of continuing to trade with whom we want to trade with, in terms of having our own friends, choosing our own friends and choosing our own adversaries, preferably not adversaries, and also in terms of recognizing that, frankly, in the scheme of things, in terms of the volume of gold that South Africa produces, and then this is the problem with us not necessarily recognizing how sovereign we are. If we decided that we're going to close the tap, Ashraf and the listeners, the world would stand still. So, frankly, who needs who here?
Okay, and just to confirm, stand the ground means will not arrest Putin if he comes to South Africa.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. As a member of BRICS, not to fight proxy battles on other people's behalf. In the same way, we didn't arrest former President Bashir when he came here. I think that those who want to pursue their adversaries should, preferably find a GPS and go and find them for themselves.
Okay. Well, there we are. We've got enough of our own GPS finding regarding the Guptas and the fugitive from the prison cell in South Africa. We've got to worry about that. Absolutely. Lebogang Peku, thanks for talking to us. Really great insights that you've shared. And I'm going to suggest strongly people listen and re-listen to this conversation. It's that important. I think in broad speak to our children, and I say this in English, okay? perhaps you should pay more attention to learning Russian and learning Mandarin, and perhaps one or two of the other traditional West African languages, and perhaps even Arabic as well, because that's where the world is shifting. You may think it doesn't happen; it's happened before. It may well happen in the future as well. Appreciate your time, Nebukang. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Asha.
Thank you. Next up, we'll talk finance of a different sort with 27.4.